you about my experiences during the 2016-2017 Canadian Space Agency astronaut recruitment campaign. It's always been a dream of mine to become an astronaut, and I want to talk to you about how I fared and what I've learned, I hope, and just give you some insight into how space agencies go about evaluating candidates who wish to become astronauts. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention, those of you who are space junkies, space aficionados will know that right as we speak, 50 years ago, the Apollo 13 crew, the US astronauts who were to be the third crew to walk on the moon and conduct scientific experiments, had some trouble. You can see, I'll highlight here, this is the service module that's designed to basically keep the space capsule and the astronauts functioning and alive. And there was an explosion in one of the oxygen tanks that virtually destroyed that service module and crippled the spacecraft in a way that NASA had to figure out a way to get these astronauts home. And right now, 50 years ago, they were just emerging from the dark side, the backside of the moon, after conducting a very ersatz experimental burn of the engine to get themselves back around the moon and back home. And so if you're interested in the Apollo 13 mission, this is a link that you can follow, Apollo in real time. Right now, they're playing all the communications and footage that they have of that particular event, and it's really interesting and exciting. And it's something, the Apollo 13 recovery of the astronauts, Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert, which you can see them here, disembarking the helicopter that plucked them out of the Pacific onto the USS Iwo Jima. They made it back safely, and that whole return process and the team that brought them back, NASA reflects on that as being one of their finest hours, or a very successful failure. And this whole competition to become a Canadian astronaut, I view as, in a similar way, as being a very successful failure on my part, and I'll elaborate on that as we move through the talk. So how does Canada recruit astronauts? How do they go about that process? Well, the Canadian Space Agency is in charge of all of our efforts with respect to space science and space research. They recruit our astronauts. The first team of astronauts were recruited when I was a young man in 1983. And so far, we've had a total of 12 astronauts leading up to the 2016-2017 recruitment campaign. And only 3 campaigns had been conducted up to that point. 8 of the astronauts that have been selected by the CSA have flown either in the space shuttle or in Russian spacecraft to go to the International Space Station. And this 4th recruitment campaign began with an advertisement in June of 2016. And it turned out it actually happened to be on my wife's birthday, June 17th, 2016, to be exact, when the space agency made its call for applications to begin the recruitment process. So I was a little bit distracted on my wife's birthday. I think that she might have forgiven me by now, but I was quite excited to see this call. There aren't very many calls that go out. And because it had been a dream of mine to become an astronaut, I immediately set to work putting together my application. And this is what the process looked like. They were looking for individuals to be astronauts who have fine judgment, integrity, able to think logically and to reason their way out of problems. You have to be able to work as a team. Both in terms of the support staff who are working to keep you safe and have successful missions on Earth, but also in space, in the spacecraft, in the space station itself. Being an astronaut means that you have to be able to work as part of a team, and normally as part of an international team. You have to be able to synthesize and communicate complex information, but also be able to communicate in plain language. To be a powerful communicator in a way that can explain what the space agency's missions are designed to achieve and what the benefits of conducting research, conducting science in space are for Canadians, but for all of humankind as well. You have to be able to speak in public for the reasons I've already outlined. You have to be a motivated individual, and you have to be able to, again, solve problems, be resourceful. These are all the sorts of skills and qualities that the space agency made clear in their recruitment call that astronauts would be expected to be able to demonstrate. Now, there's some basic requirements for being an astronaut. To be an astronaut with the Canadian Space Agency, to join the astronaut corps, you need to be a Canadian citizen, you need to be living in Canada, and preference is given to Canadian citizens, of course. You should be proficient in both French and English, and both are our official languages. You should have a bachelor's degree in engineering or in one of the scientific fields, the physical sciences, physics, chemistry, but also life sciences like biology, for example. And or you can have a doctorate in medicine or dentistry. So not surprisingly, there's quite a call for skill in the way of fixing up the human body while off planet. And so medical doctors and dentists also qualify under education. And generally, you have to be in excellent physical condition and you have to be healthy. And that's simply because there's so much time and effort and resources poured into the astronauts to prepare them for their missions that if they're not fit to fly for any reason, that's a real waste of resources. So the space agency needs to make sure that you're healthy and ready to go. There are also some basic physical and medical requirements that you have to satisfy. You can't be either too tall or too short. That's mostly to fit into the space suits that are used for extra vehicular missions and simply flying from Earth to the space station right now. You can't be too thin or too heavy. You have to have 20/20 vision in each eye with or without correction. So in the past, having glasses might have been a bit of a disqualifier, but lucky for me, as long as you can correct your sight to 20/20, you qualify. And you can't be colorblind. And this is an unfortunate reality. In certain situations, you have to know whether to put your finger on the green button or the red button, and messing those up or mixing them up would be dangerous. You have to generally be in good health. Blood pressure, for example, has to be within a small range, and you have to be able to hear well and simply to communicate by radio and otherwise to receive information. So who applied? After that call in June of 2016, about 7,800 people started their applications, and by the time the applications were due in August, 3,772 had completed their applications. So that was the pool that the space agency started with to recruit what would ultimately be the next 2 astronauts in the Canadian Astronaut Corps. You can see most of those applications came from our most populous provinces. So almost 35% are coming from Ontario, similar numbers from Quebec and British Columbia and Alberta, and only a handful of applicants from our smaller provinces and territories, as well as Nunavut. What I'd like to draw your attention to, and this is something to think about, almost 10% of the applicants were living outside of Canada. What this shows is that a lot of our highly trained, highly skilled, highly talented individuals from Canada are finding work either in the space industry or medicine or science outside of Canada. And just as an aside, and perhaps this is my own agenda, but these are the sorts of people I think we want to keep around, keep in Canada. But quite a sizable pool of talented individuals who were living outside of Canada at the time of this competition. So what was next? Well, the first thing they had us do after making sure that we met the basic requirements for application was to test our reasoning and our judgment. And they did this by administering an online test. There was 2 parts to this test. The first part was a reasoning test. They wanted to see that we could solve problems. There were 30 multiple choice questions. Some of it was arithmetic, logic, analyzing certain situations, and working memory type problems. These are the sorts of things that I would say that professors and academics are selected for, taking tests and arithmetic and things like that. This was a rather enjoyable part of the selection process from my point of view. Subtest 2 was about our judgment, and we were basically given situations to try and determine in a work environment how we would solve problems. And again, these were multiple choice questions. They want to see that you have proper judgment, that you can find the best way out of a potentially problematic situation, and to test that judgment, they administered this test. So the exam was about 3 hours in total, and we sat that near the end of August 2016. So the test was sat, and the tests were marked, and after that process, only about 1,700 of those 3,700 candidates reached the cutoff score that was determined as necessary to pass that test. So by September, the pool had been whittled down to about 1,700 individuals at that point. What came next? We needed to provide a written medical history. So really, they're trying to determine what your current state of health is, or whether or not you've had significant medical problems in the past. So they were really wanting to know whether we'd been in any serious accidents, whether motor vehicle accidents or water-related accidents. Had we had any major surgeries? Did our family have any history of genetic or degenerative disease, or histories of mental illness, for example? They wanted to know whether we smoked, just generally what sort of state we were in. And it was at this point in the application process where I needed to talk to my mother and my father and my siblings, and just basically let them know, hey, I'm really hoping to be an astronaut, and I need to ask you a few questions and make sure I'm filling out this form as accurately and as completely as possible. So that was October 2016. So after that medical history went in, and at every stage that I've talked about so far, you send in your information, your application form, or you write your test, and then you sit and you wait. And what you wait for is an email that shows up in your inbox that looks like this. And it's really exciting to get these emails. You're really anxious. You're really hoping that you can do well in the competition. And the only real acknowledgement that you get that you've done well, or perhaps done poorly, is to receive an email that hopefully begins with something like, hello, congratulations. So we're pleased to announce that your candidacy has been retained. That makes you feel really good. So this email came in December of 2016, and it informed me that there were 160 applicants left in the competition, and 100 of those would be assessed to go forward. And at this point, what they wanted us to do is to back up our written medical assessment with an actual visit to a military base where doctors there would give us the once-over. So we needed to provide blood work, we needed to provide other specimens, and then in December of 2016, I needed to take the ferry over to Vancouver to go to the military base there to have a medical exam. So by December of 2016, we were down to 100 applicants. This was where they took us to the military base. My base was in Vancouver to basically determine our health. So this is preliminary medical screening. And so they get you on the military base and they take a lot of blood. They ask you to do a lot of pretty standard medical tests, and the medical test really looks like, if any of you listening are private pilots or commercial pilots or potentially military pilots, it's the sort of exam that you need to be able to pass to be fit to fly. So in general, they're looking at your sight, your hearing, and just your general physical health, things like lung capacity, some measures of strength and coordination. And so in December, I went to Vancouver and was poked and prodded, and then I returned home to wait. So it was quite exciting in January, not long after the holiday season, to receive an email that informed me that from the 3,700 or so applicants that had originally applied, that I was one of the 72 candidates who had passed that medical exam and who would go further into the selection process. And so those 72 candidates came from all across the country. You can see a broad representation of the provinces and territories, a whole lot of university degrees from almost every university in Canada, as well as 38 international universities. About 70% of the candidates were men at that point in time, 32% women for these two spots in the astronaut corps. We were really hoping and expecting that there would be at least one female candidate who was successful. You can see of those 72 individuals, there were 210 university degrees held within that bunch. I have to tell you and be very honest with you, I was a bit of an underachiever in the group. I only have 2 degrees, a bachelor's of science and a PhD in science. Many were not only military pilots, some were doctors and engineers and pilots. It was really a humbling experience to meet these people, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. You can see that most of the degrees are in engineering, with less representation in medicine, the physical sciences, and aeronautics and aerospace degrees. So we're down to 72. So what I'm going to do now is show you a short film that talks about this first selection, and I'll just let it play for a few minutes to give you a handle on what this process was like. And who you'll see speaking is David Saint-Jacques, who's our most recent astronaut to go to space and to be on the International Space Station. There's some familiar faces here.
In history, Canada has found exceptional people ready to push the boundaries of science, innovation, and space exploration. Hi, I'm David Saint-Jacques. For 2 months in the summer of 2016, the Canadian Space Agency held an open call for 2 new astronauts. More than 3,700 Canadians from across the country and abroad applied for a chance to represent Canada's future in space. Over the next 6 months, the strongest contenders were chosen through a rigorous screening process. The first round of selections is complete, and 72 candidates have been chosen.
Welcome to the exercise called Waterborne. This water-based physical fitness session.
These talented individuals with unique backgrounds will spend the rest of a year-long process under close scrutiny. The goal of these intense evaluations is to determine which candidates have the right skills and character to become the Canadian Space Agency's next astronauts.
Some of the information your group has is irrelevant and will not help you solve this problem.
So one's going to be heavier, one's going to be lighter. Oh no, sorry.
The defective one's on the heavier side.
Astronauts need skills like critical reasoning and resourcefulness.
Hey, is there a better way to do this now that we're starting over?
Abilities like strong motivation and teamwork.
Come on, guys!
And they need qualities like integrity and good judgment. It's an arduous selection process that can take its toll. I remember personally when I went through this part of the selection process myself, realizing that at every test, there were obviously other candidates outdoing me. I would tell myself, don't let that feeling discourage you. They're looking at the big picture here. They're looking for candidates with a strong but overall balanced performance. These candidates, they're probably wondering, why are they pushing us to our mental and physical limits like this? The answer is simple. Once you're drained, once you've had enough, and all you wish for is a break, that's when the actual real test begins. As the next round of selections approaches, the testing will intensify and the candidates will be pushed beyond their limits. In the end, only 2 will be chosen as the next generation of Canadian astronauts.
All right. So that's the situation that we found ourselves in. What they did, and I have to say that the space agency is really quite good at evaluating both our mental abilities, our mental stability, our psychological makeup, generally the qualities and character that they want in an astronaut. They took us to a military base just south of Montreal, and they exhausted us physically. They didn't let us sleep very much. We were always wired up to instruments to determine how we were responding to different situations. And we were being followed around by individuals who were keeping track of our response to every situation that we were in. And they had a group of people who didn't treat us very well. They screamed and yelled at us a lot to do things, trying to put us in positions that made us uncomfortable. And in fact, putting us in situations where no clear solution could actually be found to different problems. So they tested things like our spatial awareness, our spatial memory, our working memory, how we were able to or not able to retain information, giving us bits of information over a period of days and determining whether we could recall that information under duress, and just generally giving us tasks that are similar to the sorts of tasks and situations where you need to be able to make the right choice, and you need to be able to make that choice quickly. So it was one of the most, it's not one of the most, it's the most difficult number of days that I've ever had in terms of the physical and mental challenges that were placed before us. So I'll just go back to my presentation now. I'm happy to answer more questions about that process. After that selection process, by March, there were only 32 candidates left, and that's where my journey in the process ended. I received the email saying that my candidacy was no longer retained, which was disappointing. But by April, there were 17 candidates left, and this group of people that are pictured here with Minister Baines, they're really exceptional in a lot of different ways. And one thing that I will say about this whole competition is that while you're directly competing against all of these individuals, it was such a good-natured competition with everybody wanting each and every candidate to be able to do their best. I've never been in a situation where the competition was so fierce, but also so civil. It was really an amazing period of time. And this group of 17 individuals, I think it's safe to say that as we move through the competition, any one of these individuals could have done the job, and we would be quite proud of them indeed. So by April, 17 were left. They went to Toronto for more tests, more rigorous medical tests, where again, some of the candidates weren't retained because of problems with vision or other physical potential problems. And we await in July, in fact, on Canada Day, some of you might have been watching the festivities in Ottawa, where the Prime Minister announced the two astronauts who were selected from this cohort. And experimental test pilot and combat veteran Josh Kutrick with Canadian Forces was selected on the left. And Dr. Jenny Seide, who's a combustion engineer scientist who was working at Cambridge in the UK, were selected. And it was pretty fantastic to see both of them up on the stage. And I think if you talk to anybody in the competition, they would be more than comfortable with the choice. And we're all very excited for them. And that day was pretty fantastic to see them up there. Now, since that time, and Jenny and Josh have joined our other two active astronauts who were selected in the last competition. On the left, we've got Jeremy Hansen, and there's David St. Jacques, who returned from a mission last year to the International Space Station. So our four active astronauts are certainly individuals that we can all be proud of. And the space agency is really quite adept at selecting and determining who among all of these qualified candidates will make our best astronauts and make our nation proud. So just to end, I've got a few more pictures to show you. Back in October of 2018, after the selection, I was able to, on another work trip, to divert myself Houston and get to Johnson Space Center. That's where our Canadian astronauts train alongside their NASA American colleagues, and stay with Josh Kutrick and his wife, and see a little bit of Houston and see a little bit of what their life is like there, and what training as an astronaut candidate for Josh and Jenny was like. So this is a view of the mission control that you've seen depicted in movies like Apollo 13. And I was able to have a look around at the space vehicle mock-up facility. This is where astronauts who are going into space to the International Space Station are able to work in exact replicas of each module, so that they know their way around in certain respects before they get there. That's me next to the Saturn V rocket, and the last command module to come back from orbit around the moon to the planet. That's Apollo 17, the last crew to visit the moon back in 1972, the year before I was born. So it was really fantastic to be there and to see what life could have been like, and to see Josh and Jenny doing so well with their training. But for me, my proximity to rockets is a function of the Lego sets that I've been buying lately, and I spend a lot of time with my children. I've got three children. I get to spend much more time with them. That's one thing I wouldn't be able to do if I was currently training for a mission to go to space. And so while disappointing not to be selected, there are bright sides to not serving as an astronaut as well. So, but I live vicariously through our astronaut corps, and I'm excited to see what they're going to be doing in the next 5 to 10 years. Perhaps returning to the moon, going to space again, riding United States produced rockets into space shortly, it seems. All of it's a very exciting time to be Canadian and to be interested in space exploration. And I'll finish up just by pointing out, this is from Josh's Twitter feed, but you can see him here physically distancing, socially isolating. The training continues, but it continues from home. So even the astronauts who are experts at isolation and keeping to themselves and being physically distant are respecting calls to prevent the spread of this virus and working from home. So I hope you're all doing the same. I'll stop there, and just to let you know, if you want to get into contact with me, or if you have family or friends who want to get into contact with me, I'm easy to find at the University of Victoria. You can follow me on Twitter, where I mostly tweet about science and things I find interesting. And my office and my email are easy to look up on the university website. So I'll be happy to take your questions, and thank you for being here for this virtual talk.
All right, Jay, that was wonderful. Thank you very much. And I'm not going to ask our attendees to give some virtual applause. What I'm going to do is right now I'm giving you all back for audio in the room. So hopefully that should now appear. So if you want to try and experiment, all of those people at home, feel free to turn on your microphones, and in about 5 seconds or so, we'll give Jay a big round of applause. So if we're able to do that, do so now. All right.
Thank you.
Good job, Jay. Good job. Now, what I would say is, if you have a question, what I would ask you to do is just raise your hand. And what I will do is, Blackboard is very good. It preserves the order in which you raise your hand. So if you have a question for Jay, please put your hand up. And then what I'll do is I'll call out your name, and you can actually ask the question that you want to ask, if you've got anything to go. Could it be you answered all of your questions? All of their questions, Jay?
I find that hard to believe.
Yeah. So I guess one question I had, well, we see if anybody else has them. So let's say you become an astronaut, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Typically, how long would you be training for before you go on a mission? How big of a life commitment is it?
It's quite a life commitment. So, for example, with Josh Kutrick and Jenny Seide, they were selected at the beginning of July, and they were expected to be moved and living down in Houston by August. So they do move to Houston and train alongside the American colleagues. And for any new astronaut candidate, they have 2 years of training to qualify as an astronaut. So there are a few things that you have to learn how to do if you don't already know how to do so. One of them is to learn how to pilot an aircraft. There's a lot of emphasis on learning how to speak Russian, which is also a prized skill and not easily acquired for some. And so after the 2 years as a candidate, if you pass that process, then you are an astronaut. And Jenny and Josh have both just finished that process now. So what they do then is they await assignment for a mission. So they do general training, which involves training for things like spacewalks in the neutral buoyancy facility at NASA, which is a massive swimming pool, which is one of the reasons why you see us being put through the paces in the water. You have to be quite comfortable in the water to complete the training as an astronaut. And so once you're selected for a mission, then there's up to 5 to 8 years of mission specific training. So most astronauts need to wait. Certainly the Canadian astronauts are waiting for a seat in a rocket, in a spacecraft. So it's about 10 years from selection until you have the opportunity to fly. And so the next Canadian astronaut in line to fly is Jeremy Hansen. And he hopefully will hear an announcement with respect to his mission eligibility and mission selection soon.
Okay.
Mhm.
So I don't see any other hands being raised. So oh wait, we've got Scott McIndoe has
Scott, hey Scott.
So let me just turn the audio back on. I actually turned it off. So let me turn the audio back on. And Scott, go for it. Ask your question, please. Scott, go for it. Ask your question, please.
Hey Jay, I was just wondering if there was anything in hindsight you wished you had done to prepare a little better before you went to the test for the final 72.
That's a good question. Thanks, Scott. I would say that I wish I was about 8 years younger. I guess I couldn't have prepared in that way, but I did do my due diligence to find out what the selection process would be like. I think if I could change what I was able to accomplish while I was there, I would have spent more time, some more physical conditioning. It was physically quite challenging. And I think too, the sort of tasks that we were being asked to do, my observation and the observation of other academics, so other professors who made it deeper into the competition, was that the military candidates seemed to outperform us with respect to problem solving in certain respects. The academics tend to be too much an individual in their approach to problem solving, I think. And that's something that perhaps we get accustomed to in our roles as researchers. And I think that that tendency as a group served the academic candidates less well than our military colleagues.
All right, so let me, I'm just going to ask another question, Jay, whilst just before I throw out the opportunity, if anybody has a last question they want to ask, please think about that now. But while they do that, Jay, I was just going to ask, so the one restriction I didn't see on the initial astronaut call was an age.
There is no limit on the age, and so I have to tell you, I was concerned about that because I was certainly on the upper end of the age distribution when I arrived for the selection process, and so all I can say about that, is that I think that with the time from selection to mission, you do probably want candidates that are a little bit younger. But when I was in Vancouver, the doctor who was giving me my medical had been part of the '92 selection process, and so he was quite excited to be involved in the capacity as a medical doctor in making the selection. And he pointedly said to me, "Are you worried about your age?" And I said, "Well, it has crossed my mind." He said, "Well, don't be concerned about it." He said, "Sometimes experience is an important quality to bring to any job." And I think what we'll see over the next 20 or 30 years with respect to space exploration and space flight is that older individuals are going to be going, and eventually space travel is going to be something that really is more accessible to everyone, rather than what amounts to being almost a world-class athlete, which we find in a lot of our astronaut candidates right now.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right. I don't know if that was Jim Hesser raising his hand for a question. Jim, did you want to ask a question? Perhaps not. All right. I think maybe Jim was having some connection issues. Well, on that note, let me, before I thank Jay finally, let me just tell everybody this evening, I hope you've enjoyed joining us. It's been great to have this online community formed, and we will be continuing. So we will be back next Tuesday, exactly the same time. I'll be sending out an email to advertise that in more detail tomorrow, but it's probably going to be, well, it's definitely going to be Olav Krigelson from the Center for Biomedical Research. I don't have a title yet, but I'll send out an email advertising that. The great thing about Blackboard is there's no change in the link. So if you want to join us again next week, you just use exactly the same link that you used this evening, and that's going to work just fine for you. So what I would say at the moment is then, that was a wonderful kickoff. Thank you very much, Jay. And I think you all have access to your microphone. So either virtually, raise your hand, clap your hands, wave, hi. But thanks for joining us this evening, and thank you very much, Jay.
Thanks, John. Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone. I trust everybody's well. Thanks for being here tonight. Great. Thank you.
All right. And thank you, attendees. And if you want to leave the session, you just kill the tab or kill the section in your browser. It's been a wonderful evening, and I look forward to seeing you next week. All right. Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Take care.
Thanks again, Jay.
Thank you, John.